Joining us here on the show today is a gentleman whose voice you have heard before, David Gillie from Cache County. You recognize the name because on our show last year we talked extensively about the constitutional militia. And we had probably 6 to 8 shows with David.
I think it
And
was six.
6 shows,
Yeah,
okay.
over a few months.
Several months of very interesting, fascinating material. Not all of which I've consumed as of yet, but we highly recommended that. Anyway, our purpose in visiting with David today is his candidacy for county clerk in Cache County. So, David, for those of us who haven't yet heard about you or heard a lot about you, can you give us just a 30 to 60-second description, 60 seconds, 75, about yourself and what?
Certainly.
Okay.
I'm David R. Gillie. I always insist on the R in any public setting because it honors a man very important in my family whose name was James Reed, is still James Reed. I am a recent move into Utah. I moved here about 4.5 years ago when I retired from the Navy.
And we're happy to have you.
Thank you. I have lived here before several times in my growing up, but it was in Salt Lake and Utah counties.
Mm-hmm.
So my exposure to Utah was, if you want to look at the elephant's trunk, it was the Wasatch Front.
Sure.
So I hadn't been exposed to Cache Valley. Cache Valley is a lot greener. I really like it.
It is one of the most beautiful valleys in the Intermountain
It's really
West.
beautiful, and I had objections to retiring here, and one of those was it's dry. Well, this valley isn't dry. This
No.
valley is lush,
Mm.
and it has the same beautiful mountains, but it's dry.
And
But
what-
it's not dry. Anyway, I'm a retired Navy officer, Mustang. That's somebody who was enlisted for a while and then got a commission. Retired after 30 years in a month a few years ago. I'm a widower. I have a second family by my second wife Lillian and my first wife Amy. I am natural father to one son and adopted father to one daughter and stepfather to 6 children.
Mm-hmm.
Grandfather to 6.5. I'm going to have another granddaughter in December.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, and crazy about music,
Mm-hmm.
especially Beethoven.
We're talking classical music
Yeah,
primarily.
I love a lot of music, but
Mhm.
90% of what I listen to, people would call classical music.
Awesome.
And probably for 3 hours listening to Beethoven, there's 1 hour listening to everything else, including all my favorite composers and including Led Zeppelin and
Sure.
Three Dog Night and country music and everything else.
Wonderful.
So crazy about music. I'm crazy about American civics. I'm the first American citizen in my family, and I'm passionate about American civics. If we had this upstairs in the library, I'll show you my library before we leave because I think you'll be interested. I have about 3,000 volumes, and about 2 to 3/5 of those are history and civic history, civic theory. That's my biggest passion. But boy, music is up there, literature is up there.
So that might explain why you're interested in running for a
Well,
public office.
It really does. I have always wanted to serve my country. I've always been passionate about my country, partially because I was the first American. I spent my growing up trying to persuade my parents and my older brother why they needed to become Americans. That's why I joined the Navy. I thought it was an obligation.
You emigrated from where?
My parents came from Canada when they were expecting me. So
Okay.
I was in the womb
Mm-hmm.
in a Canadian, but came out of the womb an American.
Okay, then.
By about 3 or 4 months. And it must have taken, when I was about 10, I was exposed to Jefferson, and that was the beginning of exposure to our American civic order, which I maintain is by an order of magnitude superior to anything in written history, including what our neighbors up in Canada have. God bless them. They speak the same language. Everybody says, oh, they speak the same language. They inhabit the same continent. Well, yes, that's all true, but largely irrelevant compared to the relevance of the vast superiority of our constitutional order to theirs. Anyway.
If only we would live the way
If
our
we
founders
lived
envisioned
under our
for us.
Constitution of this state, and if we lived under the Constitution of the United States, the freedom would be intoxicating. There's no man alive, no man or woman alive who has experienced lawful government, self-government in the United States. And the way these things go in history is they progress at an exponential rate. So the last 4 years, maybe a lot of people have awakened to the fact that, wait, how did I wake up so unfree? And more perceptive people maybe woke up 20 years ago and said, wait, how did I end up living unfree? And if we had any, people who were old enough, when we're more perceptive, they would have perceived that it's an exponential process, and the point of exponential processes is you don't notice until towards the end.
So, county clerk, what can a county clerk do about that?
Well, you know what? You have to acknowledge two things. And 30 years ago, I've really begun to realize that the only hope that we have for restoring a free country and restoring unanimity, or not unanimity, but at least harmony, union with our fellow citizens, really has to happen, if it's to happen at all, in a county or a state. I served our country for 30 years, did a good job, I think, of contributing meaningfully to maintaining our independence, without which you can't have a free country.
Sure.
It's a necessary but insufficient cause. But I realized all that time that once I've retired, if I do anything on the political level in elective office, it will be at the county or at most the state level, because that's the only chance that we really have of influencing something meaningfully. And we have to accept that that's going to be something on a small sphere. And nobody wants to do that. Everybody wants to, run to be the congressman or the president. And those who occupies those becomes increasingly irrelevant as the tonnage of the 100 years of momentum of corruption of Washington takes its toll.
Well, you're probably quite familiar then with Thomas Jefferson's statement that the 10th Amendment is the foundation for the U.S. Constitution.
Well, it certainly maintains federalism.
Yeah, it's foundational for the entire republic,
The
right?
whole thing, yeah.
Right, and it's the states that gathered, and they're the ones who agreed among each other to form this general government, which is subordinate to the states. But nobody believes that much anymore.
Well, you and I have to have another interview, because I've promised to have another interview about my differences with what I call Calhounianism, which begins with the doctrine that our federal constitution and our federal government, our general government, is the creation of the states. That's not quite true constitutionally. It is the creation of the people of the several states, acting at the same time as people of Virginia, people of Pennsylvania, people of New Hampshire, and at the same time acting as the people of the United States. And there are some implications, huge implications for that difference. But yes, the people of the United States are the creators, and in the case of the states, by the Constitution of 1787, the creators of the Constitution of the United States and the recreators of their several states. Because by adopting that covenant with each other, they adopted explicitly some changes and limitations, changes to and limitations on what the state governments. And when you say state, I hear state government, and you may mean the polity, in which we're in perfect agreement, the people of that state.
When I talk about the sovereignty of the states, I really mean the sovereignty of the people residing in the states.
Then we're in perfect agreement.
I think we are.
And that's the fundamental thing.
And we'll save that conversation for
We'd love to do another interview on that.
Fantastic. Because I want to learn a little bit more about why.
But that's so important. Jefferson saw that. And if you read his notes on Virginia, you see him exchanging letters with a gentleman about the concept of, let's take that ingenious that federalism concept down to the county and 100 level. And he outlines how you can do that. And I think you and I are both great fans of whatever admirers of that concept. That we need to take that federalism concept intra-state down to the county levels, so that we have constitutional arrangement vis-a-vis our state government, analogous to our constitutional arrangement between the several state governments and the government of the United States, where we take everything down to the taking of life, down to the county level, and admit the state government to exercise only that which by its nature must be exercised across the entire state.
Mm-hmm.
But Jefferson's a genius, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why we've neglected his sound advice as long as we have.
Yeah.
But anyway, the county clerk has a unique role he has, by our statute
Mm-hmm.
and by our constitution, he has several roles,
Mm-hmm.
and they're analogous to those in some other states, but with some differences. But that role which most garnered my attention or captured my attention and
Mm-hmm.
overcame my powerful disinclination to running specifically for this office was elections.
Mm-hmm.
And second to that is the county clerk's role and the county clerk's office's role as a repository of important truths.
Mm-hmm.
Those truths are facts of public-private acts, such as marriages and contracts that
Mm-hmm.
have public and private consequences in the
Mm-hmm.
future. Repository of truths such as records of what this county government has done, the acts
Mm-hmm.
of the county council, permanent records of those accessible to every member of that county, every citizen
Mm-hmm.
in that county, and what are called grammar requests.
Mm-hmm.
Grammar request is best analogized to the FOIA request
Mm-hmm.
at the general government level. And
Yeah.
as I've remarked elsewhere, unfortunately, the analogy runs all the way down to the practical fact that if you ever submit a FOIA request to the general government, the likelihood is 99% it will be immediately stiff-armed.
Yeah.
That analogy, unfortunately, follows even to the grammar that sometimes
Mm-hmm.
public officials stiff-arm
Mm-hmm.
the grammar requests that are sent into them, and it's the duty of the clerk to see that the citizen gets all the answers that are due
Mm-hmm.
under the statute as written, not what in this case has been in the news the last several months, what the governor and lieutenant governor may want to give up
Mm-hmm.
as it may affect their personal political fortunes,
Yeah.
but what the statute requires them to give up. And if you
Mhm.
want to talk about that, we'll certainly talk about that, because that goes right to the
Mhm.
duty of the clerk as the person who's charged by statute to be the go-to man, go-to
Mhm.
woman. I'm going to get you your answers, fellow citizen, to what your public servants are doing. You
Mhm.
know, that those both of those aspects drive me. The aspect of
Mhm.
the clerk is in charge of administering elections,
Mhm.
and in this state, as in many states, we have utterly pretend elections, and that
Yeah.
is utterly
Mhm.
unacceptable from a civic standpoint of
Yeah.
the duty that we owe to each other, and the fact or the truth that the principle that it is impossible to run Republican self-government
Mhm.
if you the citizens have immediate and full access to a memory of
Mhm.
the truths of what did we decide in our county council 3 years ago about this and why,
Yeah.
or who got married, when and why, or not why, but when.
Sure.
So we have a public record, because the legal consequences that grow out of that marriage,
Yeah.
you father children, you mother children, can you say mother children? And now you have rights that grew out of that fact of that marriage, and you have responsibilities. And what are my public servants doing so that I, citizen, can supervise them, superintend?
So in a nutshell, you've got elections and you have records.
Yep.
Pretty much.
Yep,
That's your
elections
responsibilities.
and yeah, vital truths that must be
Mhm.
kept, stored for immediate access,
Mhm.
and that immediate access facilitated, so that the citizens can do their job as my master and
Mhm.
properly superintend
Sure.
what I and the other public servants
Sure.
are doing.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we are visiting with David R. Gillie, who's running for county clerk in the Cache County. Just so you know, and so my next question, David, is along those lines. But a lot of our voters, they want to know how you are similar to your opponents, and also how you are different from your opponents.
Very good.
Can you describe that in a nutshell?
Absolutely, in just a nutshell.
Yeah.
My only opponent is the current incumbent. He's been the incumbent since the spring,
Okay.
Bryson Bame,
Mhm.
and the where we are one, I think he and I conceptually
Mm-hmm.
are right on the same page when it comes to the importance of the county clerk maintaining faithful records.
Mm-hmm.
We diverge on one important thing, and I've alluded to this sort of lightly and politely at some other occasions,
Mm-hmm.
is I believe, and correct me, Bryson, if I mistake this in any way, that he sees it as his duty to fulfill the grammar part of his office, at least as it applies to the current elections. However, and in what manner the lieutenant governor suggests to him.
Dictates.
Yeah. And of course, statute in our current election statute makes it the duty
Mm-hmm.
of the clerk to administer the election law in accordance with the Constitution of Utah. Implicitly, he doesn't say this explicit, the Constitution of the United States, because his oath requires that, the election statute of Utah, and the rules and procedures adopted by the lieutenant governor. Well, those things are naturally a hierarchy, and it's very rare today the public servant who recognizes that fundamental truth, that when you hold office on condition of an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, and if you're a state officer, the additional oath incorporated into that language to obey, support, defend the Constitution of Utah, you have a hierarchy of duties there. And probably the most important paragraph in one of the most important opinions in one of the most important opinion in one of the most important court cases in the history of our United States jurisprudence is the central pivotal paragraph of Justice John Marshall in delivering the opinion and decision of the court in Marbury versus Madison. And every law school student, sadly no longer every high school and college student, learns and frequently mislearns the implications of that vital paragraph. Let me read it to you.
Okay.
I wish I'd brought my reading glasses. It is emphatically the province, Justice Marshall said, of the judicial department to say what the law is. Now, when I say misunderstanding or misapplication or mislearning, in almost every law school, if you study Marbury versus Madison, you may have read the words, but what was taught to you is it is exclusively the province of the judicial department to say what the law is. Now, Justice Marshall did not say or write that, would not have dared to say or write that any time in his lifetime, even if had he believed it.
Right.
He would have been ridden out of town on a rail.
Right.
Okay. And if you read his arguments, which are excellently made, they apply precisely for the same reasons, mutatis mutandi, to every judicial officer, but also to every executive officer and to every legislative officer in the United States and in the several states. Let me go on with his language. Those who apply the rule, and this is the beginning of his argument, why what he just said is true and must be true and cannot not be true. Those who apply the rule to particular cases, that's what judges do, but it's also what executive officers do in executing the law, must of necessity expound and interpret that rule. If two laws conflict with each other, again, that's the fundamental principle of the nature of our unique polity, is that we have a constitutional self-government with a hierarchy of laws, beginning with the authority of God, down to the authority of the people in establishing the government, down to the authority of the statutes that are lawfully made, down to the authority of the executive officer who executes them, or the court that reads them. Okay? If they conflict with each other, if two laws conflict with each other, the courts must decide on the operation of each. So, I can articulate it loosely, but I actually thought this so important that if you brought this up, I would articulate it carefully in writing. And so I'll read you what I've wrote as this applies to a county clerk.
Okay.
It is emphatically the province and duty of the county clerk to say what the law is. A clerk who would properly apply the rule must, of necessity, expound and interpret the rule. If the Constitution of Utah, the statutes of Utah, including Utah's election law and Utah's grammar law, and the rule and advice of the Lieutenant Governor of Utah conflict with each other, the clerk is bound by oath. See Article 6, Clause 3 of the Constitution of the United States. See Article 4, Section 10 of the Constitution of Utah. Duty oath bound to mark out for himself or herself the operation of Constitution and statute, acknowledging and thanking the Lieutenant Governor for her advisement where it is helpful, but adopting it as a rule for his own conduct only insofar as it illuminates and does not obscure his sworn duty to properly apply the Constitution and statute, both election and grammar statute, to the cases at hand.
Yeah.
That sums it up.
Yeah.
And I'm sadly, I believe, I hope that I'm deceived in this, but I believe sadly, and if I'm correct, it deserves to be said sadly, that of the sitting county clerks in this state right now, too few of them have made a deliberate consideration of their duty in exactly this case. And I'm quite sure, again, Bryson Bain, correct me if I'm wrong, from everything you've said in our conversations and everything you've done and not said and not done, it appears that you understand your duty as well. The governor sent a letter in July to all the county clerks telling them to let sleeping dogs lie where it comes to the current controversy surrounding Phil Lyman and his candidacy for the governorship and the candidacy, alternative candidacy of the sitting governor and sitting lieutenant governor, and the instructions or advisement of the lieutenant governor, let sleeping dogs lie. The grammar statute and the election statute make it clear that you're not to provide any grammar requester in your county with or get the information from me to provide to that citizen the information that tells them how exactly I and my boss, Governor Cox, got on the ballot under statute and constitution. And that includes giving you information to show who signed the petitions and what were the qualifications, constitutional qualifications of those people to sign the petitions that put me and Governor Cox on the ballot. Were I the sitting clerk, and even as candidate for clerk, I make that a point that is my duty to study the actual law, what the law actually says, and were I the sitting clerk, to execute that law as forcefully as possible. And if it came down to seeking a writ of mandamus, to try to execute the law and do my due diligence to see that the law is executed. It's very interesting. The Phil Lyman's latest version of his suit, his second amended complaint, makes a clear point of pointing out the actual words of the relevant statutory clauses. Laws are made of words. You have to read those words and try to faithfully apply them as they're intended, and makes the argument that the governor and lieutenant governor, that Mr. Lyman and his running mate are entitled to what they have sought, and that is, I want to know the identities and constitutional qualifications to sign the petitions, which petitions purportedly, only purportedly, because we haven't seen them, put you, governor, and you, lieutenant governor, on the ballot to replace yourselves at the election this November. And they also made in their arguments, it's very well made, the point that in the past, in other cases that did not specifically touch upon the political fortunes of Governor Cox and Lieutenant Governor Henderson, the governor and lieutenant governor, have faithfully followed the statutes, and other county clerks in this county have faithfully followed the statutes to the providing of what requesters asked in grammar requests on analogous cases. So they also make that part of their argument is the governor and lieutenant governor are not following the law. They're leaning on the scale to their own personal political advantage. They also make the argument that the governor and lieutenant governor are not misapplying the law consistently in the same way. That's always, they're doing it arbitrarily in a way that appears to obviously favor their personal political fortunes at the expense of their public duty. So were I the clerk, I would see it my duty, and this is where I believe I differ quite starkly with my opponent. Again, Mr. Bain, correct me if anything you've done or said or not done or said contradicts my assessment of your position, because I don't want to misrepresent your position.
Yeah.
This is the stark difference. Were I the sitting clerk, I would carefully look at both statutes, Constitution of Utah, and correctly, hierarchically do my honest to God best duty to follow the law. And that would include consulting Lieutenant Governor Henderson. Your argument here is unsatisfactory.
Right.
Do you have a better argument to give? You cite a court case that is obviously not quite on point, and you don't cite some other things, including, you mentioned to me a recent U.S. court case that concerned a similar case in the state of Washington. You obviously don't cite some other cases that I can think of as a non-lawyer that are pertinent here. Do you have better reasons? Give me your best argument, because you are in charge of elections, and you're not in charge of grammar requests in the same way as far as our relationship, but give me your best argument, and because my duty is to follow and execute the law. I don't have a dog in this fight. My dog in this fight is that the law, that we become what we have often failed to be, and that is a country of laws.
Yes, it has. Ladies and gentlemen, again, we're listening to our guest today, David R. Gillie, running for Cache County Clerk. And just so you all know, the Supreme Court case David just mentioned that we had discussed before we began the interview was of a Secretary of State in the state of Washington who withheld names, very similar to what our current LG here in Utah is doing now. And this Secretary of State, withheld names from the voters. And
there were names of people who had signed a petition to put someone on the ballot, right?
Just like
precisely
we were doing,
analogous.
Yeah, right here in Utah. And went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in 2010 ruled that the public had an interest in those names, and so he had to disclose the names. So there we have in black and white a case that just 14 years ago, very, very similar to this case right here in Utah, and I think it's very powerful. And so what David is saying here is that he would evaluate the law. He would look at the hierarchy. He would look at Supreme Court case law. He would consult with the lieutenant governor. But in the final analysis, he would determine himself what is the overriding, the fundamental law because laws conflict all the time.
Right.
And
but
you
what
have to
exactly
decide,
do the pertinent statutes
state? You have to decide what law you're going to follow sometimes.
But just to begin by reading exactly what do they state, because to give the lieutenant governor her due, our current election law does give her some cover, and it's more than cover. It's more than cover. Our current election law is deeply flawed, and it's to the percent that it's deeply flawed, it's still the duty of the county clerks to administer it as written until it's improved, except where it plainly violates the Constitution of Utah of the United States. And right now, our current election law essentially makes 40% of Utah voters anonymous to varying degrees from the rest of their fellow voters. Now, that's a fundamental flaw in Civics 101.
Yeah.
But it is the law, but not in the lieutenant governor's favor is the fact that she makes more out of that screen than is actually there, and fails to disclose data, very analogous data in similar cases. How did you get on the ballot? Let me see the signatures.
Yeah.
In other cases, she has, Phil Lyman argues, perfectly complied with the law in providing what was requested, but only in the current case that in which it appears that she and the governor are leaning on the scales in favor of their own private political interests instead of their public duty. That's what Lyman's suit alleges, and also alleges that in that leaning, governor and lieutenant governor are violating the law as written, not following it faithfully as they have in other cases. So that's the duty of the clerk, to sort that out. What does the law demand, and try to do that, seeking seeking enlightenment from jurisprudence as well as from the governor's and lieutenant governor's offices, but ultimately accepting the responsibility that a sworn oath gives you as any public officer in any capacity to follow and faithfully execute the law, beginning with the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of Utah, and the pertinent statutes in that descending order.
So speaking of election law, I was quite, I think it's very illuminating to compare the current law with a previous law. And,
yes.
And in the video that I watched last night of David, he has, how many pages is that law that from 150 years ago, election law?
Okay, yeah.
Took
so,
how many pages?
Yeah, I have almost everywhere I've spoken, you've done this object lesson, because sometimes object lessons speak volumes.
A picture is worth 1,000 words.
A picture is worth 1,000 words. So this is the first election law, 3.5 pages of the provisional state of Deseret.
Okay,
This
3.5 pages.
3.5
Remember
pages.
that number, folks.
Yeah.
3.5.
This is the first election law of the territory of Utah. And 46 years beyond this, when Utah finally gained statehood, Congress's Enabling Act in its penultimate clause, it was section 119, I think that was the penultimate, I think there's one more after that, said that the current election law of the territory of Utah will, until amended, be the election law of the state of Utah. And
how many pages is that one?
And that's 3 2/3.
3 2/3.
Okay, so both of them under 4.
Excellent. Okay.
Now, this is our current statute, and it's been relatively recent that it is evolved or devolved to its current prolixity and corruption. And that, I argue, is where we need to retrace our steps as the people of the state of Utah.
So David is holding in his hand.
Let me tell you. Yeah, go ahead.
Is holding in his hand about a ream of paper.
Yes.
So about 500 sheets. Probably.
Let me tell you how many pages. It's 743 pages.
Okay.
228,433 words.
Wow.
It is a monstrosity. It is an abomination. It is a blasphemy. It is an insult to ourselves. It is a dishonor to ourselves and our fellow citizens. When I read it, and I may be mistaken in my reading, when I read it, what I see is the effects of party hacks trying to get one over on each other.
Yeah.
Republicans, mostly Republicans and Democrats, trying to get one over on each other and jousting, wrestling with each other over the past decade and a half to try to get one over on each other and to bamboozle or buffalo their constituents. That's what I see. But I can prove by showing you that it is possible in only a few pages to write an election law that is absolutely honest, absolutely understandable by every citizen, and absolutely delivers a real election. Whereas this monstrosity that I've pointed to, the fact that it can't be understood by the citizens is not its only flaw. That's a fundamental flaw. But its fundamental flaw is that it ensures that there will be no real election. In other words, our current statute prescribes a pretend election in several points, demands, requires by law a pretend election, does not permit a real election, and that's its greatest flaw.
Yeah, so let's talk about that in the 5 minutes that we have remaining, David. The difference between a real election and this pretend election.
Okay. Wow, are we down that? I'm too prolix.
Time flies.
I'm too prolix. Okay, first of all, a real election is conducted under an election law that every citizen can understand. A pretend election law is written under this monstrosity that by design he cannot understand.
Right.
A real election is conducted, and this is fundamentally important for so many reasons, in a precinct and is regulated at the precinct level. A pretend election is conducted at the county, that's how it is in our state, or the state level, and is regulated by the state. A real election is conducted under the direct purview of sworn election judges, specially sworn for the case, whereas and prohibited by law from compromising their own duty and position by currently being candidates for elective office. A pretend election law makes the election judges, the county clerk, the county councilors, the lieutenant governor, the governor, does not specially swear them separately to the task, and allows them by law to compromise their own position by being current candidates. In a real election, every step of the process, from how you get on the ballot to the qualification of each voter under the Constitution to cast a ballot, to the casting of the ballots, to the canvassing of the ballots, to the tallying and reporting of the final result, every step is conducted under the purview and the potential challenge of every voter in a precinct, which is a number manageable that they can know each other and observe each other. County level is 75,000. In this case, that's impossible. If we wanted to, it's impossible because there are too many. Secondly, in this state, I recently did this experiment last spring. I sent out mailers to the county's latest version of registered voters, 300 of them. 100 of them came back undeliverable because it's a number too big to manage, even if you have goodwill. And thirdly, because our current statute makes 40% of our voters essentially semi-anonymous to each other, so it's impossible for them to verify each other's constitutional qualifications to be there. But then the casting, by statute, the way we run it, it's impossible to know who cast how many ballots when. It's impossible for the voters to enforce and superintend the canvassing and to challenge. That's the whole point, the potential challenge. The canvassing, the tallying, and the reporting. And finally, the canvassing, that's the coup de grace. The canvassing is not done by real eyes on real paper ballots and with real voices and pens in real human beings' hands, but is instead done in a private room on a computer that admits by law only a select few individuals, which individuals are not allowed by law to know the algorithm that is doing the canvassing and tallying, which algorithm they know by law is changed at the last, it's called a trusted upgrade, but they're not allowed to know what that is. So in the final analysis, in a real election, every step of the process, you and I as fellow citizens stand witness to each other and guarantor to each other of the integrity of the process. Whereas in a pretend election, what we have now, instead of giving each other as fellow citizens the security that we deserve, that we owe to each other, instead we ask our fellow citizens to satisfy themselves not with firsthand knowledge, but with the certification of the Board of Canvassers. By statute, the county council is a board of canvassers and is required by law to certify this election. But the very statute prevents those counselors from knowing, makes it illegal for them to know what it asks them to certify. So instead of you and I standing and doing our duty to each other by witnessing to each other and guaranteeing to each other the integrity of this most important function, instead we ask each other to be satisfied with not firsthand knowledge witnessed by their fellow citizens, but a certification of a handful of their public servants who are prevented by law from certifying what they're certifying, from knowing what they're certifying. It's like going to a court of law and cross-examining the witness. You ask the witness questions that go to his or her veracity, but you also ask the witness questions that go to how and whether the witness is in a position to know the things that he or she attests to.
Exactly.
So that's we're in a world of hurt. So it's my intent to execute this monstrosity as we have it, but to argue tirelessly before citizens, county council, state legislature, that we owe each other a great act of civic repentance. We owe each other a dumping of this and a return to something very much like this, that is absolutely honest, absolutely understandable, absolutely the real thing.
Wow, that's wonderful. Well, you would make a marvelous county clerk, I believe, David, and I hope the voters of Cache County will provide, due consideration of your candidacy and cast their vote for you.
And I hope they do. And if they do, it won't be an easy battle. It'll be against a tremendous
Mhm.
inertia of corruption and obfuscation.
Yeah.
But the citizens, we owe each other something like this, and I hope I can rally the citizens of this county to lead the way in the state, and eventually lead this state
What?
to be a marvel, to be a role model in the union of, hey, let's go back
Mhm.
to real elections. You
Yeah.
can too.
What is your website, David?
It's gillieforcountyclerk.com.
Can you spell Gillie for us?
Gillie, gillieforcountyclerk.com.
And that's the word for or the number for?
Oh, the word for
For?
it, Gillie,
Okay.
FOR, Gillie, FOR,
Mhm.
countyclerk.com. Please explore it. You can go into much greater depth
Mhm.
into the things that we're discussing.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed talking with you.
Oh, it has
as
been a
always.
pleasure.
Yeah,
It's always good to visit with you, David.
very good.
So knowledgeable, and passionate
Passionate.
about
That's
this.
what I am. Sometimes I'm accused of being too passionately American, but I don't believe it's possible to be too passionately American.
That's right. Well, thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. You have been listening to David R. Gillie, candidate for county clerk in Cache Valley,
Cache County. That's in Cache Valley, but it's Cache County, Utah.
Cache County, Utah. Thank you for that clarification. When I think of Cache County, I always think of Cache Valley because
Yeah, but
of the
half the
butter.
valley is in Franklin County, Idaho.
That's
That's why
right.
I said that.
That's
We
right.
share it with Idaho.
That's right. Yes. Well, we bid David the very best of luck. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will conclude our hour of here on the path to state and local sovereignty. And thank you for being with us.
Thank
Thank you,
you
David.
very much.